Tenakoto, Tenakoto, Tenakoto katoa, ko Allegheny te maunga, ko Potomac te awa, no America aho, ko Jeffers toko whānau, ko Wesley toko ingoa, ke te mehana America aho e mahiana. Welcome everyone to Making Movements after COP26. I'm so excited that you can join us today. You're in for a great session. Thank you for making the time for this program. My name is Wesley Jeffers. I am the Deputy Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy here in Wellington. That means that I'm second in command for all of our public engagement here, our cultural programs, educational programs, really all of the fun stuff that an embassy gets to do in a country. Today, we're together to talk about some very important issues, namely climate and youth, and how those two things come together. This is a really pivotal moment for all of us here on screen and for all of you listening, because last week, COP26 concluded. World leaders, including US President Joe Biden, came together to come up with commitments, solutions, and negotiate different ways forward to combat climate change. There's been a lot of press after COP26, some of it good, some of it bad. The one thing, though, I think we can all agree on is that youth really had a big presence at COP26. There were over 100,000 young people that marched in the streets of Glasgow to talk about climate and climate change and how important this issue is for their future and all of our futures. Even former President Barack Obama urged the youth in Glasgow to stay angry about this issue. So it's something that is really at the top of policy importance for young people today. For this session today, you will not be able to have your video on if you're in our audience. You also will not be able to unmute yourself. But as we go through the session, please enter any questions, comments, or thoughts you have into the chat. We have a team of people that will be reading your questions and comments and delivering them to me. And eventually, after we hear from each of our incredible presenters, we'll be able to get to answering some of your questions. So one question we have to ask ourselves now that COP26 is over and we're thinking ahead to the future is, what happens next? How do we make movements after COP26, looking forward to COP27 next year in Egypt? And where do youth fit into all of this? Especially today, we'd like to know, what can we learn from past US climate, youth, and human rights movements to inform our future and our future after COP26. So you have three incredible presenters on your screen today. I'm so excited to introduce all of them. I'll give everyone a brief bio, and then I will turn it over to our first speaker, and we'll get started. So today, we are very privileged to have Bronen, the Executive Director for the Alaska Institute for Justice. She is a human rights attorney who works with communities forced to relocate due to climate change. She's worked with the White House Council on Environmental Quality to implement former President Obama's Climate Change Task Force recommendation to address climate displacement. She's also worked with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees Climate Change Office. She's a senior research scientist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and she co-founded the Alaska Institute for Justice, which is truly an incredible NGO that is the only immigration legal service provider in Alaska. They house a language interpreter center. They train bilingual Alaskans to be interpreters. They also serve as a research and policy institute focused on climate and social justice issues. She has been published in CNN, HuffPost, The Guardian, and she also has quite a range of experience in the South Pacific, including in Fiji and the Solomon Islands, working with climate forced displacement populations. Our next speaker will be Jennifer Frost, who is a historian of 20th century United States society, politics, and culture at the University of Auckland. She is the author of an interracial an interracial movement of the poor, community organizing and the New Left in the 1960s, Hollywood celebrity gossip and American conservatism, producer of Controversy, Stanley Kramer, Hollywood liberalism and the Cold War. She has various other collections, and probably most exciting, she has a new book coming out early next year, if I understand correctly, called Let Us Vote, Youth Voting Rights and the 26th Amendment, that will come from New York University Press. 2021 actually marks the 50th anniversary of this enfranchisement of 18 to 20-year-olds, which was the last significant expansion of US voting rights and supported by a broad and bipartisan coalition. And our final speaker will be Dr. Maria Armoudian, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland. She is also the host and producer of the radio program, The Scholars Circle, and the author of 3 books, Lawyers Beyond Borders, Advancing International Human Rights Through Local Laws and Courts, Kill the Messenger, The Media's Role in the Fate of the World, and Reporting from the Danger Zone, Frontline Journalist, Their Jobs and an Increasingly Perilous Future. She's published a lot on human rights, environmental justice, and before she came to Auckland, she was a commissioner in the city of Los Angeles for 6 years and worked in the California State Legislature for 8 years, working on many different issues from environmental sustainability to good government to corporate reform. She's been published in many different publications, from the Washington Post to the New York Times Syndicate to others. She's also a songwriter and musician with a CD titled Life in the World. So as you can see, these are 3 dynamic, incredible women that we get to hear from today. They're also, by chance, all American experts, which is pretty amazing. Before I turn it over to Robin as the first speaker, I just want to give a big thank you to the U.S. Department of State for allowing us to have Robin Bronen as part of this program. I'd also like to thank the University of Auckland for allowing us to have Jennifer and Maria here and for working with us on so many different endeavors here in New Zealand. And with that, I will turn it over to Robin Bronen.
Thank you so much for that awesome introduction. And I'm going to share my screen now. So thank you so much to the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Embassy in New Zealand for the opportunity to speak about climate justice, an issue that I'm very passionate about. And Anita Hill, who is a law professor in the United States, just came out with a memoir that really resonated for me because she talked about the relay race for justice. And when I started doing justice work in my 20s, I thought I was in a sprint and I needed to work as fast and as hard as I could and run as far as I could to have justice happen as soon as possible. And then I realized I was in for a marathon, and it was for my entire life that I would be focused on justice issues and making sure that everyone had access to the resources they need. And now I realize it's a relay race, and that the baton needs to be passed to the youth who have been rising up for generations to ensure that human rights and justice are the foundation for all people on our planet. So I'm going to start, I always start to talk about what's happening in the Arctic, because the Arctic is experiencing dramatic changes that are really terrifying. And on your screen, you can see a map of the polar north. It's right here. And this is from the winter, which in the winter in the Arctic, the sun doesn't rise. And the reason why I always start with this is because the Paris Agreement aspirationally was trying to have us not go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, 2 degrees Celsius increase at the most. And as you can see in the Arctic, we're already at 6 degrees Celsius increase when the sun does not get above the horizon. And that is causing dramatic changes for the entire world, but particularly for people who live along the coasts of Alaska. So on this screen, you can see the graph for Bering Sea ice, which is ice that grows during the fall and winter, and it has been dramatically decreasing because of those increased temperatures. And then down here, you can see the consequences of that. Without Arctic sea ice, there is not the protection that communities normally have to protect themselves from the storms that come in. So when I'm talking about climate justice during this talk, climate justice is about climate adaptation, and climate mitigation. And I'm going to be focused on adaptation and what climate justice looks like for the people in the Arctic, in Alaska in particular, who are faced with these really dramatic changes. And we came up with the indigenous peoples that we work with this new hazard in Alaska called ushtek. It's a Yupik word, and it means catastrophic land collapse. And it's caused by the combination of thawing permafrost, erosion, and flooding. And as a consequence of this, the federal government, the US government, has done a number of reports documenting these dramatic changes for Alaska Native communities. In 2003, they found that 3 communities were seeking to relocate. So 3 communities made the decision to relocate because they can no longer stay in the places where they currently are located. And then just 6 years later, the federal government did a second report, and they determined that there were 12 communities that were seeking to relocate. So these 12 communities are located in the interior of our state and also on the West Coast. I'm going to be focusing on this community of Newtok. So I decided to go back to graduate school to learn climate science back in 2007. And at that time, Newtok was in the process of trying to relocate their community. They've actually been trying to relocate their community since the 1990s, because that's when they started experiencing the dramatic changes from climate change. And when they started to their process of relocating, they began working with 25 different federal and state government agencies to facilitate their relocation. This is their community during one of those fall storms where that Arctic sea ice is not present. And you can see that the land on which they're living is dramatically decreasing, and they're also actually sinking into the water. There are no roads connecting Newtok to any other location within the state. So the only way that they can evacuate is by getting in small 10-seater planes and getting to a safe location. The tribal government actually in the early 2000s identified a relocation site, which is across the Ninglik River. This is the Ninglik River. It's across the Ninglik River, and it's on thawing permafrost. And so this tribal government has been trying to relocate now since the 1990s. When I started doing work with the community of Newtok, all the tribal government and all state and federal government representatives said the community had to relocate by 2012, or they would be in a humanitarian crisis. It is now a decade past almost that 2012 deadline, and only 1/3 of the community has been able to relocate. 2/3 are still in this location, which has gotten intensely more hazardous because of these ongoing changes from the climate crisis. And there's no timeline when the remaining 2/3 of the population, about 300 people, are going to be able to be safe. So when I think about climate justice, I think about there are 3 critical pieces to climate justice when we're talking about climate-forced population displacement. And the first is, it is critically important that we understand the historical legacies of racism and colonialism in order to understand how communities like Newtok got to be in the situation that they're in. And in Newtok's experience, and they're actually not the only ones who had that experience, it was Alaska Native communities in general, where the federal government determined in the last century that children needed to go to school, and the barges that would build the schools determined the places where those schools would be built. And so they needed to be, the barges went to the most easily accessible places, which are the places along the coasts of Alaska. And the tribes used to be migratory, so they migrated to harvest foods. And because of this federal government policy, they were then required to become sedentary. And they acquired the public infrastructure like schools and health clinics, post offices, airstrips, that make it now very, very difficult for them to relocate. And so understanding this has been critically important to the tribes to figure out now what they want in regard to the future places where they want to relocate to. Human rights are the second critical piece to climate justice. And what's important about human rights in this context of climate forced displacement is there is actually no international human rights doctrine that addresses with climate forced displacement. However, there are a number of international human rights treaties and soft law that outline the human rights principles that must adhere to any process where a community or an individual is forced to move from their home because of the climate crisis. And so you can see on the left-hand part of your screen, these international human rights documents like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the international covenants. And these are the human rights that are absolutely critical to think about when we're thinking about climate justice, climate forced displacement, and what it means to protect populations when they are being forced to leave their homes. The thing that's also really important to think about when we're talking about human rights in this context, human rights are often thought about as individual rights that adhere to a person. And in this context, it's got to be collective, the collective rights of people who are either connected through a tribe or a clan, but also connected through kinship ties and cultural ties. It's critically important that we think about these collective rights. And as the tribes that I work with adhere to, the right to self-determination is the most important human right in this context, because they need to be making all of the decisions about whether they relocate, where they relocate to, and how they relocate. And one of the reasons that the right to self-determination is so critical is because governments have a horrific legacy of forcibly relocating populations for either development concerns or geopolitical reasons. And in the United States, the US government forcibly relocated the Anungan people who were living on the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to Southeast Alaska during World War II, when the Japanese were bombing the Aleutian Islands. And the Anungan people did not make that decision, and 10% of the population died as a consequence. The other thing that's critical in the right to self-determination is this right to traditional foods. Because for Indigenous populations in Alaska, being connected to their traditional grounds and the places where they harvest food is critical for their culture and for them to thrive. And so for them to figure out where they want to relocate to is a critically important question that they need to answer so that they can continue to maintain access to those their traditional harvest grounds and their traditional foods. In 2005, Sheila Watt-Cloutier, she was the head of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference at the time, and she filed what I think is the first seminal petition, human rights petition. It was against the US government, wanting the US government to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions so that their culture, the Inuit culture, could be maintained and could continue to thrive in spite of the climate crisis, which was dramatically altering the places where people were living. And this was, again, 16 years ago. And as Mr. Jeffers just mentioned, we just concluded with COP26, where we're incrementally moving forward in addressing the climate crisis. But these fundamental issues about justice and climate forced displacement there's still a lot of questions that haven't been answered, and the funding hasn't been provided so that people can get access to the resources they need. The community of New Talk, in their process of making the decision to relocate, they decided that it was critically important that they identify the guiding principles for them and their community to adhere to as they were moving forward in this awful process of relocating their entire community. And these principles were important not only for their community, but also for the state and federal government agencies that have been working with them to try to facilitate their relocation. So the first thing that was really important to them is that they wanted to remain a unique, distinct community and not be relocated to another well-established community where they would not be able to maintain their cultural identity. It was critically important, as I said, the right to self-determination, so their voices come first, and that they make all of these decisions related to their relocation process. And that relocation is not just about infrastructure. It's about nurturing their spiritual and physical well-being, respecting and enhancing the environment, that people are actually hired so that this provides their community members with the ability for them to have work and employment as a result of the relocation so that they are building their future together. And then the final piece in what I think of climate justice is about equity and justice, like what that means in the context of climate force displacement. And there are two components to this issue in regard to equity and justice. And one has to do with climate finance, and the other has to do with loss and damage. And these are terms that are part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so the climate finance piece is critical because, right, that's the funding that will enable countries to be able to adapt and mitigate to the consequences of the crisis because we are not reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm just going to read for you what the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Adaptation Committee said in 2019, that adaptation costs were going to range from $140 billion to $300 billion per year by 2030, and could rise to $280 billion to $500 billion per year by 2050. And that was 2019. In 2015, in 2009, when COP15 happened, the global community agreed that they would fund this climate finance $100 billion a year. And that has not happened. And we're almost a decade after we're more than a decade after this report the 2009 COP15 occurred. And in this year at COP26, they said that the promise is now officially delayed to 2023. And that is going to make it extremely difficult for the countries that are faced now with this ongoing crisis of figuring out how they are going to adapt, to be able to adapt to the crisis that is causing them to not be able to, populations, particularly along the coast, that are needing to relocate. And as you know, this is not only happening in Alaska, it's also happening in the South Pacific, where Vunidogoloa in Fiji was the first community in Fiji to relocate because of the climate crisis. Loss and damage is the other term that is used in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this has been something that small island developing states and other countries had been advocating for now for about a decade also, because it's not just enough to provide the financing for countries to be able to adapt and mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions. It's also critically important that funding be provided to address the fact that climate impacts are happening that are damaging the infrastructure that people need in order for them to live in the places where they live, as well as their culture and the things that are important for their heritage. And so this piece about non-economic loss must be included when we're talking about loss and damage. And loss and damage is still very controversial in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And after COP26, there's still no mechanism to address loss and damage, which really impacts the ability for countries to be able to receive the resources that they need, and for climate justice to actually be embedded in how countries are able to respond to the impacts and also adapt. So in Alaska, we've been working not only with the tribes in Alaska, but we recognized about a decade ago that there was tremendous synergy between what was happening in the Arctic and what was happening in the South Pacific. And so in 2018, we brought together 16 Alaska Native tribes and their tribal governments, as well as 8 countries from the South Pacific. We brought clan leaders and NGOs to come together to share their experiences and to raise their collective voices so that they could accentuate the importance of climate justice for for them to be able to respond to the way that climate was impacting their communities. And they came out with a declaration where they were basically asking not only for their voices to be heard, but to understand that their human rights, their collective human rights, need to be front and center when we're talking about climate justice and equity and how they want to vision their future in a climate-altered world. And so thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to share what's happening in the Arctic and its connection to the South Pacific. And climate justice must be the foundation upon which we deal with the climate crisis. Thank you. Over to you, Wes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Robin. Really appreciate that overview of climate justice and climate forced displacement, especially. Just as a reminder to everyone joining us via Zoom or via our Facebook live stream, you are tuned into Making Movements After COP26, and we are discussing U.S. youth, climate change, and human rights movements that inform our future. I'd like to now turn it over to Jennifer Frost as our second speaker.
Thank you, and I'll share my screen as well, just to have a bit of guidance for my talk here. So thank you, Robin, and just, obviously filled with so much gratitude that you're there on the front lines, facilitating the efforts and movement for dealing with these climate displacement issues in the Arctic. And, I sort of feel I've been spending the last years behind my computer at my desk, but I hope that looking back to the past and specifically the youth franchise movement just can give us some reminders or lessons about how we build movements, how we succeed, and really how we convince to bring more people along with us. So for the last few years, I've been working on my book, which, as Wes mentioned, is called Let Us Vote, Youth Voting Rights and the 26th Amendment. In 1971, so indeed 50 years ago, the youth franchise movement achieved the 26th Amendment in the United States. And the 26th Amendment gave the right to vote to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. It also abolished discrimination on the basis of age. Now, before the United States did this, other countries had, and in fact, the year right before, 1971, Britain, Canada, Germany had enfranchised 18-year-olds. Soon thereafter, New Zealand and other countries did too. So there was this historical moment in the 1960s and 70s when people in power, in political power, in government, in really even among the public, recognize that young people should have a voice and be able to participate in democracy and in politics and government in a way with some real power through the right to vote. But it took a lot to persuade those people to come along and agree that young people needed the right to vote. So one of the questions I've asked in this book is really, how do we understand and explain the success of this movement? And is there any lessons we can take away for where we are at today? And I think there are. Obviously, the 1960s and 70s was a historical moment of flourishing of social movements for civil rights and indigenous rights, decolonization, women's rights, gay liberation, as well as against war, against poverty, against nuclear proliferation. So there is this moment of the 60s and 70s out of which the youth franchise movement comes. And really, all of those movements, young people are at the forefront of all of them. So they had already made the case that they were interested in political issues, they were taking political action, and they felt they deserved the right to vote. But as they worked on this movement, they met very strong opposition. And so we need to think about, what did they do to try to overcome this opposition? Well, the first thing is, I think, recognizing it was a long struggle, that the struggle for youth suffrage in the United States and elsewhere was not easily accomplished. Some people could look at the movement, which really emerged in 1969 and succeeded by 1971, as a swift and easy, successful victory. But in fact, the movement had built on all sorts of efforts and campaigns going back 30 years. So we can look and say, oh, that movement succeeded so quickly, but it's only because they were able to draw on all the work and foundation that had been done before them. So I guess one of the things I want us to keep in mind when we think about social and political change is that obviously it comes slowly and then it can come very fast. And we don't know where the turning point is. And what we have to do is, of course, stay hopeful, stay persistent, and continuing with our struggle. And that's one thing the Youth Franchise Coalition activists and leaders did. The second thing is they understood that change comes from the interaction of top-down and bottom-up forces. So they worked closely with politicians, government leaders, the heads of different organizations, as well as at the grassroots, building all sorts of movements and even small groups and organizations in campuses and communities. And so what could happen is they would be in Washington, D.C. or in the state capitals, organizing, lobbying, negotiating, compromising with legislatures. At the same time, their grassroots allies were putting pressure on these same politicians through letter writing, through petitions. And it was together, top down, bottom up, that brought about the historic change of the 26th Amendment. The other thing that we can see they did is they built a broad and bipartisan coalition. They realized they couldn't achieve it alone. They needed adults, older adults. They needed national organizations. They needed the two political parties. And so they worked very hard to build a coalition that included young people from the two political parties in the United States, religious groups, education groups, labor unions, women's organizations, all sorts of other community organizations, and especially civil rights organizations. And what they could do with this coalition is remind them that coalitions don't have to agree on everything. They just have to agree on the one thing, the one goal they are seeking. And in that sense, what the Youth Franchise Movement did was convince everybody that their movement, their constituency, their organization had something to gain from the right to vote. And so they thought it was a way to both bring people along, both out of public good and thinking about the collective and the community, but also kind of personal group interest was going to be benefited. So that flexibility of understanding that let's define our goal in a way that shows people that they have a personal interest as well as a public interest in achieving it. And that was an important effort that they pursued. In addition to their broad and bipartisan coalition efforts and really helping to build the coalition, was they advanced multiple arguments for youth voting rights over time. They started with really the most influential argument, which came to be summarized as old enough to fight, old enough to vote. And what that pinpointed was that in the United States, the military draft age was 18. And of course, this is during the Vietnam War. The military draft age was 18, but voting rights didn't come until age 21. The profound unfairness and injustice of that gap of 3 years was something that persuaded many people to support youth voting rights. But that wasn't persuasive for everyone. So they talked about young people fulfilling citizenship responsibilities in addition to military service meant they deserved citizenship rights. They were wage earning, they were paying taxes, they were marrying, they were starting families. They talked about the fact that they were educated and had the maturity to vote, that they were interested in political issues. They were already engaged and they wanted to have a voice within the system rather than only being kind of relegated to protest or persuasion from outside the system. And those arguments, if you didn't agree with one of them, maybe you would agree with another one. And they felt that these multiple arguments were a way to allow more people to agree with the movement. They also pursued a range of strategies, what I call strategic flexibility. And similarly there too, they felt that to give people a lot of different entrees or entrance points to the movement, you didn't have to come in only one way and through one strategy or only agree with one, with all the arguments. You could come and help with organizing, lobbying, talking to legislatures, petition writing, letter writing. Also, they worked on litigation efforts and a massive public education campaign. They got the word out through pamphlets and leaflets and events among young people and with older organizations. And the thinking there was that, everybody can do something, large or small. They didn't minimize any contribution. They felt it all added up, and it did. And it led to success finally in 1971. So in 1971, with the 26th Amendment, tens of millions of young Americans were enfranchised, and then in the years since, it's been many more millions. The youth vote hasn't always made a difference in elections, but it has in different places at different times, locally and also nationally, and especially recently. With climate change and also in the United States with gun violence and police brutality, young people have been mobilized. They made a difference in 2020 in the United States, but they also made a difference in the EU elections in 2019, just this year in Germany, as well as 2020 in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I'm from. So the youth vote has made a difference. And I think we need to keep remembering to use the tools that we do have. Of course, protest is vital, persuasion is vital, education is vital, but we all must use the vote that we do have. And I just wanted to end with a quote from Juan Carlos Monterrey Gomez, who's the 29-year-old climate activist. He was the lead negotiator for Panama at COP26. And he said, the most effective way to change the system is to get into the system. And he wanted to send that call out to all the young people. And I would add to that one way to be in the system is to vote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I love that quote. And thank you as well for this wonderful overview of the struggle for youth suffrage and the 26th Amendment. Just as a final reminder to our audience, I know you're muted and we can't see you, but you can put your questions on social media or in the Zoom chat because pretty soon we'll be able to ask and answer some of your questions. But I would like to now introduce our third and final speaker, Dr. Maria Armoudian. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Wes, and thank you so much for the opportunity to do this event with these esteemed colleagues of mine, Jennifer and Robin, and to be with you, and really just to present this research in this coherent way. So thank you to the Embassy and the State Department in Wesley, and everybody who's been involved in putting it together. So I am going to talk about how movements start, by using the example that I sort of inadvertently found when I was researching Lawyers Beyond Borders, subtitle, which is Advancing International Human Rights Through Local Laws and Courts. So Lawyers Beyond Borders is really about several phenomena. For one, it's really about the art and the craft of the possible. It's about how, in the face of enormous obstacles, a person can start a movement when there seems to be no solution. And that seems to be a bit of what we are facing today among multiple crises that are coming together at once. In this case, one person's creativity and actions started a movement for redress for survivors of egregious human rights abuses like torture and genocide. And the movement for redress was happening in US courts using US law. So in part, it's about agency, but it's also about ideas and creativity, which I would argue are the essential components of the start of a movement. Now, first, of course, the idea of rights. And the book is also about how rights are constructed and how easily they can be deconstructed, because that is what's happening in some cases. And as one of our extraordinary rights scholars, Charles Epp, says, rights are not gifts. They are not gifts. So why now, the question before me and why led me down this path, why do millions of survivors of torture, genocide, slavery have no recourse and no redress? Well, this is in part the structure of international political systems, right? Like the idea of states themselves, the idea of state sovereignty, the idea of jurisdiction, all ideas that making this system, nearly all politics is made of these ideas. And they're ideas that people have agreed on and then they enforce. But if you look at these ideas today, they are not working in the ways that they should, because there are so many multiple crises, massive humanitarian crisis, massive public health crisis, environmental crisis, refugee crisis. And these are all because the ideas have not expanded to really address these matters, right? And it's going to get just so much worse, as Robin was just talking about, as the climate crisis unfolds. So let's just imagine, for example, that you are living in an authoritarian country. You've been living in that region for generations, you're indigenous to the land, and imagine that your government saw you as either a pawn or an obstacle to its goals, whether that was an ideological goal or absolute power or minerals to make money, extracting minerals from the ground. And you and your community and your home happens to be in the way of these goals. You and your entire community may protest, protest removal, protest contamination, protest other things that may come when your authoritarian government wants access to your minerals or some other goal that you're in the way of. What has been happening is that these governments respond often with massacres, torture, imprisonment of you or your loved ones. And so then where do you go for any sort of justice, much less redress? Well, because of this system of ideas, there's really hardly anywhere to go. And at the time that that I was researching this book, and the time that this was developing, there was really nothing. But there was a lawyer, an American lawyer, who also was a refugee from the Holocaust survivor. He's still alive today. He's 95. He's really a remarkable guy. I just have to say his name, Peter Weiss. And he was inspired by some classic ideas like Cicero, Aristotle, ideas about, morality and law and justice. But he was also inspired by the idea of universal jurisdiction again, an idea. And what universal jurisdiction is a concept that says that some crimes are so heinous and so awful that they should be prosecutable anywhere. So these jurisdictions that courts and countries create, would not necessarily apply. And he wove all this together and found an old law, an old statute that was passed by the very first Congress in the United States as part of the Judiciary Act. It was called the Alien Tort Claims Act at the time. Now they call it the Alien Tort Statute. And he thought, this statute, which essentially says, that aliens can use the U.S. federal courts, or that federal courts had jurisdiction on their cases, on their torts, on their civil wrongs, if the violation also violated the law of nations. And he said, well, this sounds like universal jurisdiction to me. And so this was 1979. It was this period of time that Jennifer was just talking about, where there was a lot of activity around making, social change, political change, particularly the civil rights movement. And what the civil rights movement was so profoundly extraordinary with was using the U.S. Constitution and using lawsuits, civil litigation, to essentially have laws that the democratic bodies were making declared unconstitutional, and thereby advancing rights and redress rights for people whose rights had been destroyed. And so Peter was steeped in this, in the civil rights movement and also the human rights movement, and was really a trademark lawyer, which was really funny. And he met, at the time, a Paraguayan doctor named Joel Filardiga, who had opposed his authoritarian regime. And his son, his teenaged son, Juelito, was tortured to death in Paraguay by the Paraguayan regime as sort of a punishment to Joel Filardiga. And Peter met Joel, and he thought, well, why don't we test a case? This was what the civil rights movement did. They tested cases. They tried to expand the law through these test cases. And so he represented Filardiga's, the daughter Dolly and the father, and sued in U.S. courts using U.S. law, tying them to international law, because law of nations, and eventually won about a $10 million settlement. I don't think they collected, but they did get Peña Irala, the man accused, deported from the United States. So this defied all expectations. And it was one really guy advocating to try this. But when they won on appeal, it inspired a movement. It inspired other lawyers to also try. And they sued other violators of international human rights. And they started building case law, and they built a foundation of rights for foreigners who, didn't live in the United States or had come to the United States. And it started to build this rights movement right there in the United States for people who had been egregiously violated in other countries. Well, then Congress got inspired, and they passed a law to support them, the Torture Victim Protection Act. And it really essentially reiterated this right that foreigners had, expanded it to U.S. citizens, and each step expanded these into more and more uncharted territories. That included 3 law students who had been in Burma, now Myanmar, and who were documenting human rights, but had come across people who had been forced to work on a pipeline, tortured, or their loved ones killed, that the regime had forced them to work on, but it was in partially in service to building a pipeline that was connected to and was in, the profits were going to an oil company that was based in the United States. So these law students, along with one of the activists in Burma, now Myanmar, they built a nonprofit organization and they sued the Burmese regime. They sued the oil company, which was Unocal at the time, which is now merged with somebody else. And they ended up getting a settlement for about $30 million, which, pays for a lot of really great things in Myanmar. Others built other NGOs, then they took it abroad. And so what you can see here is that these sort of outlandish ideas that can get grounded into something real can spawn a movement. Sadly, the movements can also get crushed. And I would not say this movement has been crushed, but I will say it has been injured. And even though there have been a lot of people who have gotten redress, either through the movement that Peter Weiss started with his ideas and his really determination, that it has been extremely whittled down, the capacity, both because the Supreme Court has become more conservative, because the United States has become so polarized. I connect a lot of that to the work I did in my first book, which was called Kill the Messenger, which is that once the United States changed the laws around broadcasting and eliminated things like the Fairness Doctrine, and you ended up with these, shock jock kind of radio hosts that really promulgated that the enemy is inside America, that the enemy is people who don't think like you necessarily. And it's created this thing now where an ideology has emerged and the polarization is so bad that people can't really talk across these lines anymore. But I think what I want to say is not so much about that, because we're talking about building movements now for human rights, is that even when the United States started to close its doors, its courtroom doors, that Peter partnered with people in Europe, and there's a really alive universal jurisdiction movement there. And other advocates, like one who's died recently, who had started another NGO from the Bay Area called the Center for Justice and Accountability, they went on and partnered with NGOs all over the global South and in Canada. And so this has really spawned into a global movement, and the solutions are happening all over, not just in the United States. It's still a really difficult road, but it really starts with people doing something, with ideas, and with being able to creatively put these ideas together with facts. So it's about agency and audacity to do something in the face of no possibility. And of course, that takes expertise and research, and the real grit and time commitment. It is a relay race, as Robin said, because we do have to pass the baton, and it does take time. But these are obviously things that are so well worth it and can be done. Again, they're ideas that affect the very real lives of people and the environment that we rely on for our basic survival. So thank you so much, and Wes, back to you.
Thank you so much, Maria. I really appreciate that overview. And I really like that foundational idea that ideas can spawn movements, all sorts of movements, but especially for human rights, potentially for climate change and climate justice as well, to combat climate change, that is. So we are approaching the end of the session. However, I think we can all go a little bit past 2 o'clock just to get in a few questions and answers, if our wonderful panelists don't mind sticking around for a couple more minutes. Thank you so much for those detailed, wonderful, really insightful overviews. It gives everyone watching us from Zoom and from social media a lot to think about. So we've had a few questions come in. I'm gonna kind of combine 2 questions here at the beginning, but as we've all kind of mentioned, COP26 just took place last week. Kind of the readout from COP26 is pretty mixed, depending on what you're reading, who you're talking to, who you're hearing from. Some positive things have been said, which is, for example, the Glasgow Climate Pact, which is the resulting document from COP26. It's the first UN climate deal to explicitly mention the need to move away from coal power and subsidies for fossil fuels. But then on the other hand, it didn't really go far enough. And there have been a number of different things that happened, especially Robin brought up climate financing. There's been a lot of criticism that, countries didn't make enough commitments as far as climate financing goes. So kind of a two-part question I'd like to ask any of our panelists that we've received from the audience is really, do you think that we've reached a tipping point in our society where those in a position to address climate change actually will at some point? And adding on to that, the weight of the burden is really on this climate movement, which puts a lot of pressure on the communities we're talking about today. Communities like youth, especially youth protesters, Indigenous leaders, and Indigenous communities. And these particular communities and audiences are really feeling the effects of climate change and anxiety about the climate crisis, perhaps more so than any other communities. So how do we really ensure and maintain that these communities have the social license to be a part of this movement and to make change happen in the future? I guess what needs to happen within these communities, or what can we do for these communities to make sure that they can contribute to our climate solutions in the future?
Well, I guess I'll start, since I was talking about climate justice. And honestly, that's why I talked about this multi-generational relay race, because it feels critically important in regard to answering the first part of the question, that youth continue to rise up, because it's really about their future in regard to what the environment will be like, that will determine what type of a life they will be able to live. And unfortunately, from my perspective, living in the Arctic, the negotiators haven't done enough, and they haven't done enough for a long time, because we've recognized the urgency of action. And, even in this most recent document that just came out of COP26, they use the word urgent, but there's not the action that shows that there is the urgency that's required. And then in regard to the second question, I've thought about this a lot, and I think, coalitions are critical, and making sure that that we provide the spaciousness to understand the different movements like Black Lives Matter and the Indigenous rights movement, and to find the commonality, so that, because together we're stronger and more powerful. And I think the challenge has been how to do coalitions where all voices are heard and we're honoring what each community feels is critically important in regard to ensuring that justice and equity are part of the climate dialogue.
I'd like to just. Oh, sorry, Jennifer. Okay. I think I want to say a couple of things. One is, one of the biggest problems we're facing when it comes to the climate crisis is that all of our economies and lifestyles are wrapped up in emitting carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. And so you can't solve one problem without solving another problem. And so the conversation has to obviously be around, how do people continue to live their lives and stop the mass emissions. So I'll give you an example here in New Zealand, and then there's some in the United States too. New Zealand's economy is entirely wrapped up in dairy farming, which is one of the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide and methane, actually more methane, into the air. And so it's the country's dependent on it for its very existence. So these are the things we need to think about in terms of economic transformation and fast. The second thing is we don't need bigger, better, more all the time. And so I think one of the things we have to talk about is who are we and what matters, right? And this is something that happens. I'm a political scientist, and one of the things we look at are values, in particular, the political communication of who are we, right? What are the values? Is it really about getting a bigger car, or 2 cars, or 3 cars, 4 cars? That is a fundamental communication problem. It's a fundamental political problem to get to returning to who we are as humanity, as opposed to what we own and how much more we can get. Always new ideas and creativity to come into this. And then finally, I really think that a big problem deals with the denial, climate deniers of the science, and how easily now people have been persuaded to this anti-science and believing that, people who do understand the science are the enemy. That it just makes it really difficult to come to any sort of an agreement when you treat somebody, another human being, as an enemy, when you could be talking about something that could be a shared future. So look, I think changing our values is the most important thing. It can't be just about getting richer and richer. It can't be about owning more and more. It can't be about Jeff Bezos's, billions. All of these people need to come to the table and see the role that they're playing and realize that this is not, what's good for us at all on any level, personal or political or as a planet. That's a communication problem.
Yeah, and actually, thinking about climate communication and that issue of showing people how it is personally relevant. Maybe they don't care about the polar bear, on the diminishing iceberg, but they certainly care about a flood in their backyard. And so, trying to bring it home, because unfortunately not everybody cares about the public good or cares about humanity in general. And so exactly how do we communicate with them? But I just want to be sure that one of the things that's important to me about coalition building, and thank you, Robin, I just of course completely agree, is that the youth franchise movement had lots of older allies, right? They couldn't have achieved their aim without older allies who helped fund, who voted for the youth voting rights, et cetera. And often my students will say to me, the burden is on us, like you all are leaving us this world. And I keep saying, no, we're there with you, right? We are not just going to leave it to you. We are your partners. We have obligations, and we know that. And I just think I don't ever want the rhetoric or the responsibility to be solely we're with you, and whether it's giving money or doing various things. I just think that coalition, of course, has to reach across the generations. It's so lovely seeing sort of the older activists in the UK and other people saying, they want to save humanity for their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, and they're all in too. So anyway, I do think that that's an important message to send. You're not on your own. We are here.
I love that message. Makes me feel better. And Jennifer, actually, on that same point, we had a question come in from Hannah, which is a question for you, but others can jump in too, but it's staying on the theme of coalition building. But Hannah was wondering, in your studies of coalition building between groups for the youth vote, what have you found about how groups dealt with their differences and with possible conflicts? Did some groups have to sacrifice more than others? And she says, thinking about how much of a voice different groups get in the climate conversation now.
Yeah. That is an important issue, and definitely one of the principles of the Youth Franchise Coalition is they sort of said everybody could do their own thing. So I know that sounds very 60s and 70s, but that was one of the things they said. That as long as you were contributing to the larger aim, they weren't going to be purist or really limiting in terms of what strategies you used or what arguments you made. So that was trying to be very flexible, in that sense. But there were conflicts, and there were conflicts really mainly coming from the right. So kind of picking up what Maria just said. That there were people who were conservative and were against youth voting rights, or were even for youth voting rights in principle, but didn't want to work with other people in the coalition. But I think then, as in now, actually those people are a minority. I mean, Maria, I just saw recent polling that said climate deniers in the U.S. are about 7% of the population. So, it is a minority. And what the main thing is that middle group needs to be persuaded, and that's where your point about communication, and I do think coalition building can help.
Also, the other thing that we have found when we looked into communication on climate is that people who think it's just doomed don't want to do anything. And so I think it's really important in our communication to not make it all doom and gloom, to make it about the art and craft of the possible, right? To make it about the craft of the possible, and to find all kinds of ways. Like it really has to be a panoply of ideas about how to get out of this climate crisis. Some of it will involve sacrifice, obviously, and there has to be a way to frame that it doesn't hurt so much.
Yeah. Well said. To move us away from coalition building for just a moment, we have kind of a fun question, more about the legal aspects of things, since all of you mentioned some legal aspects of climate justice and of youth movements and of other movements in some way. But this is coming from Partev. What are the possibilities of a group of attorneys going to The Hague on behalf of the general population of the world to go after corporations responsible for climate change? Since it's a crime, since it's harming everyone, it's a crime against humanity as a whole. And this person is saying, they like to think big and global. This could be considered the ultimate tort case.
Robin's the lawyer here, so I'll let her take it, but I'll just say that there are some really interesting lawsuits happening right now on the international stage. Robin, go ahead.
Yeah, well, and I'm sorry, I don't have it off the top of my head, because lawyers have been using litigation now in relationship to the climate crisis for quite a while. And actually, one of the first cases was filed by the native village of Kivalina, which is in Alaska. And that was, over a decade ago. And unfortunately, what's been happening is the lawsuits have been dismissed. Lawyers are using a variety of legal strategies to get beyond this. One of the rationales for the reason for the dismissals is that this is a political question and not a legal question that the courts want to step into. One place, though, where it has been successful is actually the Netherlands. And I'm not completely familiar with the case, but what I think I remember is the whomever filed the lawsuit trying to force the government in the Netherlands to reduce their emissions, they won. And now the government in the Netherlands is needing to comply with that decision. So lawyers are using a bunch of tools. We are also at the Alaska Institute for Justice. And as Maria said, it's coming up with those ideas that are novel and pushing the legal system, whether it's at the international level or a national level, to stretch legal precedent so that these novel ideas can become part of law.
Here in New Zealand, there are a group of lawyers also who are challenging the government using the tool of judicial review. And that they are also trying to force the government to further reduce emissions on these matters. I think that's also happening in Australia as well. So I know they are happening all over the world, and it's one or two of these getting some traction is going to make a difference, I think. Yeah, I had something else to say, but I lost it. It's just, we're getting old. I'm getting old.
No. You just have so many incredible thoughts, and we want you to share all of them. We will have to start wrapping up soon, but I want to ask one more question that we can answer, and then I'll turn it over to each of you to make a final comment or thoughts if you'd like. But the last question I'll ask is coming from Emily. How might the importance of Indigenous self-determination, highlighted by Robin, articulate with Jennifer's analysis of the need to include diverse entry points when building an effective and powerful social movement? When there are so many diverse communities that are affected, how do we balance the general and the specific without repeating colonial injustices of the past?
Yes, that is a really important question, and I don't have a succinct answer to, honestly, because as we've been saying, it is about coalition building, and it's also about relationships. Relationships, when I was in the talk that I gave when I was talking about climate justice, and the first thing that I thought of as being critically important was understanding historical legacies of colonialism and racism. And I think as a I am not Indigenous, as a non-Indigenous person and as a person who is also not a person of color, it is critically important for me to understand these legacies that are current now. So their legacies have not ended. They are infused in our legal systems, whether it's national or international, that I understand these systems so that I can be a better ally and know what the appropriate entry point is in order for me to share the skills that I have to create the change that we all want.
Well said. Thank you, Robin. Well, with that, we are over time now. We still have a lot of people watching, which is really exciting. I hope our audience has enjoyed all of the presentations and the conversation and the dialogue today. I feel really good just after kind of reading about everything that happened in COP26. I'm glad that at the end of our conversation today, we're able to really talk about some of these more positive aspects of the climate movement too, things that we need to do in the future, like coalition building, relationships and relationship building. That's honestly what a lot of diplomacy comes down to as well. I feel like that's what we're doing every day here at the U.S. Embassy. So I really appreciate you sharing all of those thoughts. But with that, since we are at the end of our time, I'd like to just turn it over to each of you to make a final comment or a final suggestion to our audience about actions they might be able to take. Or anything like that, anything that you'd like to say at the end of this. So I'll turn it over to Robin first.
Well, thank you again for this opportunity. And to go back to what Jennifer said, I completely agree in regard to the passing of the baton. As I started my presentation, it's to be in partnership with youth so that I am supporting their vision of the future that we all want for a sustainable world.
Excellent.
And I have to
Thank
say,
you, Robin.
As a historian, and I do spend a lot of time thinking about the past as well as the present and the future. And I think one of the things, I get a lot of hope from history. I know that we have a lot of stories of the past, which of course, genocide and colonialism and all the horrific legacies of the past, but we also have a lot of really positive legacies of the past too. And part of that is people who sustained themselves and each other to keep after a vision. And many of them didn't expect to succeed in their lifetimes, but they understood, just like Robin started us, we have a moral obligation to continue the work even if it means we're not going to see the victory or the success in our lifetime. I got lucky to study a group like the Youth Franchise Movement who surprised themselves when they actually won. But that's not also why you're in it. You keep doing it, and we do have lots of examples of people of the past, both shaping their present and very much our future. And I try to keep my eye on that. So thank you. It was wonderful to share this moment with all of you.
So let me add my thanks, first of all, because what an amazing bunch of people you are. And I feel really honored and privileged to get to be with you. Look, I concur completely with Jennifer and Robin and Wes on this, especially on the relationships part. And look, I think there are some really difficult bridge building exercises that need to be done. And I really do think that part of that is embedded in the question of, the bigger question of who we want to be and what it is that we're committed to. And so there's got to be ways to see through the divisive framing and to find the common ground that brings us all together. And the planet is certainly one of them, we need it. It's pretty hard to live without it. So, so bridge building, communication, and ideas, challenging the ideas that don't work, coming up with the ideas that can be the replacements.
Excellent. Thank you so much. A huge thanks to our incredible, dynamic, amazing, wonderful panelists, Robin, Jennifer, Maria. This was an incredible time. I wish we could do this every week, honestly. Just carve out some time in your schedules. But thank you so much for all of the incredible work you're all doing with climate, with youth, with Indigenous populations. It's much needed. And thank you for these positive closing messages today, too. We have a lot of youth and a lot of other communities watching us today who are going to be able to take these messages and do something with them and put them into action, we hope. Let's all stay tuned to what's happening around us, work on these relationships, work on the coalition building, confront these challenges and overcome them together. Like Maria said earlier, we don't need to view each other or others as enemies. We have to find ways to work together. But thank you so much again. Thank you to the Department of State. Thank you to the University of Auckland. And thank you to our incredible audience on social media and Zoom. We've loved spending this time with you, and have a great day.